Hi guys and welcome back, it's Jason, and all the time I get asked questions about photography. And what I've done today is I've taken out 6 of the most common questions I get asked about taking photos, and I'm going to share those with you today, and I'm going to answer those and maybe they'll help you out. Now, number one is what are the basics of taking a good photo? And, obviously art and photography and things like that are all subjective, so good is defined by the beholder. But the ins and outs of taking a good photo start with learning things like exposure and ISO and shutter speed and aperture and depth of field and things like composition. And my last video, which I will put up here, was exactly about composition. Now, a few videos before that, and I will link that series down below, you can learn all about exposure and ISO and depth of field. And once you get to know the ins and outs of all of these things, those are the basics for taking good photos. Go watch those videos when you get done watching this one, and those will help you along your way, and that will start you out on your journey to taking better photos. Number 2 is, what are megapixels? We hear cameras being sold about, it's this many megapixels. Well, a lot of people don't understand what that truly means. In every camera, there is a sensor. Your sensor is made up of all of these little pixels. And a pixel is just a little square on your sensor, and there's millions of them on there. And 1 megapixel is 1 million pixels. So 1 million of these teensy tiny little squares. Now, a lot of cameras hover in the area of about 20 to 25 megapixels, and that's usually a pretty decent range for megapixels. But it doesn't really matter what the megapixels is when you talk about all of the information that I mentioned in subject number 1. Once you have a handle on those, the megapixels don't really matter. Unless you're going to be blowing your pictures up to huge sizes, that's when you start to factor into megapixels. And megapixels aren't necessarily the most important thing about your camera. Basically, more megapixels just means more little squares on the sensor itself. So basically what that means is it may be able to provide you a bit more detail in your photo. The pictures are the pixels are smaller, and you can get more intricate details based on those pixels. But one thing you have to factor in is the more megapixels is the bigger the picture is actually going to be that is being saved on your camera. So that means more space is being taken up on the storage card in your camera, and it's also more space taken up on your hard drive once you dump that picture off of your camera onto your computer. Another question I get all the time, number 3, is what is manual mode versus automatic or auto? I think that's, auto is pretty self-explanatory when it comes to taking pictures. Basically, you're just pressing the button and the camera does all the work. It comes up with all this shutter speed and ISO, and it calculates all of that stuff for you, where you don't really have to think about all of that stuff, and you are literally letting the camera be the brain of taking the picture. Basically, all you're doing is pointing the camera at what you want to take a picture of. When it comes to manual mode, that's a whole different story. You have complete control over all the settings on the camera. You can set shutter, you can set aperture, you can set the ISO, you control what light's coming into your camera, you control the depth of field, you control every setting on your camera, and that's full manual mode. Now, there are stages you should take when you're learning manual mode, and because it does take practice. There's a lot of practice when it comes to taking manual mode and taking pictures with manual mode, and it's definitely something that you need to practice with. So if at first, learn your camera, learn the different settings, start with auto, and then jump into manual mode and start learning what these different settings do. Number 4, quite often I get asked because people hear the term white balance and they want to know what white balance is. Basically, white balance, what it means is it allows you to get the proper range of colors in your picture. So if something's meant to be blue, it's meant to be blue, it looks blue. If it's meant to be orange, it looks orange. But also another factor of white balance is there's a thing called color temperature, and that is measured in degrees Kelvin, and that ranges somewhere from like 2700 degrees Kelvin to I think 85 degrees 100 degrees Kelvin. And basically, I know those numbers sound strange, but basically with that, if you're down here on the 27, that's like a warm orange light bulb that you would have in your home, and the other side, the 8500 or 6500, daylight is 5500 degrees Kelvin. So basically from there you're getting whiter and bluer and a much colder color light. So somewhere within that range, your white balance you would adjust to make sure, and you would notice that in pictures that some pictures are a little greener, or they're a little bluer, or a little more orange, they're colder or they're warmer, and that's factors of white balance. Number 5 is a question I get quite a bit with when it comes to editing, and you see a lot of marketing that says this photo is unedited. Well, yes and no. When you think about editing, if your camera's on full auto and you're taking a picture, well, technically the camera is doing the editing for you, because what the camera sees and what the final picture that you see on the back of your camera, there's been a whole bunch of changes and adjustments and colorations and white balance adjustments, etc., made by the camera, even when you're on auto, that is technically editing to the original picture. So when somebody asks me, do all pictures have to be edited? Essentially, yes. When the camera is editing it for you on auto, it's creating what's called a JPEG. And most people are familiar with the term JPEG, what a JPEG picture is. Now, I shoot in what's called RAW, and all RAW pictures have to be edited. And RAW versus JPEG brings us into the last question I get the most. Number 6 is, what's the difference between a JPEG picture and a RAW picture? A JPEG picture is essentially a compressed, smaller picture from the original RAW file. So basically, if you're shooting in RAW, which I do most of the time, 99% of the time I'm shooting in RAW if I'm using my camera, basically a RAW photo is everything that the camera sensor sees. Now, you remember me talking about the camera sensor when we were talking about megapixels. Well, the sensor has all of those little pixels, and a RAW picture shows you everything that every one of those pixels on your camera sensor saw when you snapped that picture. And a RAW photo has to be edited, because when you put it on your computer, it just looks kind of gray and flat and a really boring, undimensional picture. Now, the reason for that is because all of the data is there. Everything that you can possibly apply to that sensor, when you open that shutter and the picture comes in onto your sensor, all the data is there. So you have to tweak that data. You have to keep what you want to keep and remove what you want to remove. And that's basically what you're doing in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever editing software that you're using. Now, the difference with a JPEG, a RAW file is very, very large. It's all your megapixels. It's everything that you can get out of your camera. A JPEG gives you a much reduced version of that same photo. So basically what it's doing is it's taking away some of the pixels. It's taking away some of the detail of your photo. That's why you don't want to take a JPEG, take it into your editing software and start editing, because on average, you're talking about removing from a RAW file to a JPEG, you're talking about removing 65, 70, 75% of the actual data to go from a RAW file to a JPEG. Now, people may ask, why would I ever want a JPEG? Well, one thing is when you go to upload a photo online or anywhere, or on your website, on Facebook or Instagram, they have limits of how large your photo can be. Now, a regular RAW file may be 50 megabytes. When you have the file done and edited, where just a JPEG maybe 5. So it reduces the size of the file so that it's easier to use, easier to send, transfer, and all of those interesting things that you would do with a JPEG file or a photo that you want to use. So that's it. That's the 6 most common questions that I get all the time. There's plenty more, and I may do another video in the future that has more questions and answers. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask about photography, put them in the comments down below. And while you're down there, please hit that like button. It helps me out with YouTube, and hit the subscribe button, and I will see you again in the next video.